shallow seafloor in various parts of the globe are found sophisticated megalithic structures, which obviously were built during the Ice Age, because the sea level rose several hundred feet at the close of the Ice Age, and that resulted in the submergence of these megalithic structures. Maps by the Ice Age navigators who settled these regions indicate that the mariners of ancient times measured and mapped the Earth with fantastic precision, even accurately mapping Antarctica, which is shocking when we consider that Antarctica was supposedly not discovered until the year 1818 by the Russians. The mapping technique utilized by those ancient navigators is actually embodied in the astronomically derived dimensions of the Great Pyramid of Giza in Egypt, which was on the prime meridian of ancient times, whereas today, Greenwich, England is on the modern prime meridian, and the meridian or longitude from which our modern timekeeping system is based. We will explore how the ancient mapping and timekeeping system was the forerunner of our modern one, and so how ancient civilizations could measure and map the globe with essentially the same methodology as our current system. Archaeologists have long suspected that in ancient times, navigators were successfully sailing and settling disparate parts of the globe in search of mineral riches, as evidenced by the sophisticated megalithic walls, citadels, and pyramid-like temples which have been discovered in India, Japan, on the islands of Polynesia in the Pacific, and across to the Andes Mountains in South America, where the great ancient megalithic structures such as Machu Picchu of the pre-Inca civilization are found. To the west, from the cradle of civilization in Mesopotamia and Egypt, are found megalithic constructions near mineral deposits in southern Spain, off Malta, on islands in the Atlantic such as the Tenerife Islands, and across the Atlantic to the fantastically sophisticated structures of the pre-Mayan Olmecs in southern Mexico. On the Ryukyu Islands of southern Japan are found ancient megalithic walls, terraced plazas, and citadels of the ancient Jomon civilization, commonly considered to have been built at around 2000 BC. Not much after megalithic buildings is believed to have begun worldwide, and some of these structures are now on the shallow seafloor nearby, in waters down to at least 100-foot depths, submerged by the sea level rise from the melting of the Ice Age ice packs.
In some cases, so-called experts or popular authors have assumed that if you got a structure underwater, you can just look at how deep the water is, somehow correlate depth of water and with how fast waters have risen. And in some cases I've seen people assume if it's under so much water, it must date back, say, 10,000 years or more. And that's not a good assumption.
Graham Hancock's work, he's done some fabulous research through the years. He's one of the few that came out with these photographs of these submerged megaliths that are on the shallow seafloor from various parts of the world. Great shots. His wife's a photographer, pointed this anomaly out, these megaliths on the sea bottom, and shallow seafloor. And he says, yes, they were covered up when the Ice Age ended, but he goes with the conventional date of 10,000 BC for the end of the Ice Age. But I began looking at this. No, it doesn't make sense.
And I would say the last thing that probably convinced me that it was man-made was that discovery on the second day of a dive trip when we went down and saw this this rounded rock, huge. It's 15 feet in diameter, 12 feet high, rounded rock, and it's setting on a square pedestal that's on a flat rock. Now, this flat rock is as flat as a pool table. The pedestal is about 8 to 12 inches above this flat rock, and it's also as flat as a pool table with an 8-inch, if you can think of it, just 8-inch relief pushed up. It's beautiful. It's perfectly square. And then there's this 12-foot high, 15-foot wide rounded rock. And the round ball is obviously not contiguous to the square platform. And that was impressive to me.
So you could have, for instance, a city or a culture that's now underwater, totally submerged, but it may date back to 4,000, 5,000 BC. You don't need to postulate that goes all the way back to 10,000 or 15,000 or 20,000 BC, as some popular writers have suggested.
I did see structures above the water that are on the land. And these structures were in vicinity of the Seki Point, but closest to where the underwater face is. It's on the north side of the island, and these rise up about 70 feet above the water's edge, and they are carved almost identical to the monuments at a Seki Point. It really makes you feel, if you've dove a Seki Point and then you walk to these monuments, you feel like you're underwater again.
Halfway around the world from Japan, in the waters off the coast of southern Spain, just west of the rocks of Gibraltar, which were known as the Pillars of Hercules in ancient times, are submerged ruins apparently built by the Phoenicians, who mined the rich gold, silver, and copper deposits of southern Spain, beginning at around 2000 BC.
After speaking to Francisco Salazar, Paco, a very important diver in Spain, and spending time with him, he said to me, Maxine, there are 4 submerged cities off the coast of Spain. I've read about Atlantis, Maxine, and I believe one of them is Atlantis, but we need to do some more exploring. And after many, many years, Paco was able to get photographs of this civilization, which we are absolutely confident, by water level and location, is Atlantis.
When did the Ice Age end? Well, almost all the experts say that megalithic building began on the Earth around 3000 BC. But they say that the Ice Age ended at 10,000 BC. So there's a disconnect there of 7,000 years. Now, which was it? Did the Ice Age end much later than advertised? Or did the megalithic building begin much earlier than advertised? It's important that the conventional scientists state a date for 10,000 BC for the Ice Age, because the Ice Age people were supposedly cavemen developing in the Darwinian way slowly through thousands of years. So you have your cavemen at 10,000 BC, you have your megalithic building that they acknowledged at about 3000 BC, so you had to have a continuum of development for say 7,000 years.
Aficionados of Plato's Atlantis story know that he said that Atlantis went under 9,000 years before his time, which would have put the submergence of Atlantis at about 9500 BC. However, The Mycenaean kings of Athens, also mentioned in Plato's story, who were ruling around the time that Atlantis went under, are known to have lived circa 1500 BC, and not circa 9500 BC. So, apparently, a zero was added to the 900 actual years before Plato's time, and the Athenian kings in the story and the submergence of Atlantis were therefore at around 1500 BC.
So everybody wants to know, what's up with Atlantis? Well, as it turns out, Atlantis is just the megaliths that are now submerged just west of Gibraltar. Plato himself said Atlantis is just west of the Pillars of Hercules.
When I finally saw the photos, we had a city about 2.5 miles wide by 2.5 miles long. We could see fireplaces, we could see remnants of buildings, we could see pottery, all sorts of things, 120 feet down on the continental shelf. Well, we know there were civilizations certainly off the coast of Egypt, Alexandria. We know that there were civilizations, certainly we've seen underwater cities off Malta, off Crete, off Ireland. So everywhere in the world, the whole history of the world lies underwater.
These megaliths, are submerged off northwest India, southern India, Malta, Egypt, Lebanon, and off the coast of southern Spain. They're in about 50 to 100 feet of water.
Submerged megalithic complexes are also found in the Mediterranean off Slima, Malta, where were discovered megalithic walls and temples which appear to be of circa 2000 BC vintage, and off Egypt in the Mediterranean, where are found the submerged ruins of ancient Rahinet, known to the ancient Mycenaeans of Greece as Heraklion. And off Lebanon, where are the submerged megalithic ruins of the ancient Phoenician port city-states of Sidon and Yarmuda, which disappeared from the pages of history at around 1500 BC. And off the coast of Greece near Plytra, Abdera, Platygiali, Astakos, and Elafonisi are found submerged megalithic complexes which were submerged when Greek legend states that the sea rose and covered a great part of the land. And on the shallow seafloor off northwest India are vast complexes of brick-based structures from the legendary civilization of the Rama Empire, which according to ancient Vedic literature were submerged by the sea apparently at around 1500 BC, as that is when the stories of the early Vedic literature are said to have occurred. And those submerged ruins in the gulfs of Cambay and Kutch off northwest India are virtually the same as the ancient ruins of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, which are nearby on shore and which are commonly thought to have been built circa 2000 BC.
The ancient Hindu and Tamil traditions of southern India speak of a lost kingdom, the kingdom of Kumari Kandam, which is off the extreme southern tip of India, and they mention a king, King Nedion, who was a Pandyan king around 2000 BC, who had to flee inland because his kingdom was being eaten up by a sea level rise. Now, the conventional scientists would have us say that this story must have been from before 10,000 BC when they say that the Ice Age ended. Therefore, to witness a sea level rise like that tells us that the Hindu writers must have been at that time frame also, at 10,000 BC. But the Hindu writers, the Hindu scholars all say, no, that material comes from 1500 to 2000 BC.
Geologists tell us that the seas were about 400 feet lower, and they calculate this based on the size of the ice caps during the last ice age, and so that's where most of the water was that has caused this differential in sea levels. Therefore, if we have advanced civilizations near the height of the last golden age, you would expect to find much of that along the coastlines, because even today you'll find 80-85% of the population gathered towards the coastlines. That's where people like to live.
And what we know is that, of course, since the end of the last ice age, sea levels have risen. They've risen dramatically over that time period. And quite logically, ancient peoples lived near the coastline. And when you have that much water rising, in some cases, their cities, their habitations were totally inundated. They're now found underwater, if they're found at all.
During the Ice Age, North America was connected to Eurasia across the Bering Straits. That was dry land, and that got flooded. England and Ireland were connected to Europe, and as the water rose, that got flooded.
Professor Kimura shares with me his findings that he presented to a Japanese forensic society that studies these kinds of things, and he shared his report with me while I was doing research for these articles. And it seems that they hypothesized that as the water tables began to rise, that they had to shift from the monuments that I dove on in Iseki Point, and they had to shift because the monuments were infiltrated with water. They had to shift to another site on Yonaguni. Now those are two sites that I photographed and I understand, and Kimura thinks this shift came some 4,000 years ago, which makes sense to me.
Many ancient legends speak of a surprisingly rapid sea level rise as kingdoms were engulfed within a generation.
There are several Mayan documents or books that survive. One is called the Dresden Codex. It's primarily about the Venus cycle, but there's a very interesting page. The last page of the Dresden Codex depicts a flood coming out of the mouth of the cosmic monster.
But we can also have relatively abrupt climate change, literally on the timescale of decades. And that's where this interaction of the atmosphere and the ocean, for example, if we have a lot of meltwater, a lot of fresh water at high latitudes, it can shut off what we call the overturning circulation of the ocean. That can give rise to relatively abrupt climate change on a timescale of literally decades.
Some scientists say that all of the submerged structures from various parts of the globe must have been the result of earthquake activity. It was previously thought that the Ice Age ended at around 10,000 BC, and thinking that megalithic building began about 8,000 years after that time, many say that the submergences of all those ruins must have been due to earthquake activity, and not because of sea level rise, such as Yarmuda off the coast of Lebanon.
Earthquakes to have caused that submerging, we see evidence of a 200-foot vertical block fault somewhere in the hills of Lebanon around there, and there's no evidence of that. There's no evidence of horse or grabens reflecting 200-foot blocks of the coastline dropping into the sea.
And the same can be said for the other submerged megalithic sites in various parts of the world. No evidence of block faulting by earthquakes. Therefore, the sea level rise spoken of in the various ancient legends must have been the cause of the submergences of all the sites. That huge sea level rise could have resulted only from the melting of the Ice Age ice packs. So the great ancient civilizations were flourishing during the Ice Age, when there was intense snowfall in the extreme latitudes and much heavier rainfall in the middle latitudes, in regions such as Mesopotamia, the Indus of northwest India, and in Egypt. These regions are currently desert wastelands, but during the Ice Age, when these civilizations were flourishing and building their biggest and best megalithic structures, those lands were lush green areas of fertility, with pastures and forests providing bounty for the humans and the many kinds of animals which inhabited those areas when they received about 40 inches of rain per year. The ancients would not have selected Egypt to build their extensive and complex megalithic structures if it had been the parched desert wasteland which it is today. This is confirmed by the fact that the Nile River of early Egypt lapped at the paws of the Sphinx when the Nile was 50 feet deeper because of the much greater rainfall.
What I found is the core body of the Sphinx enclosure in which it sits, has classic rain erosion, precipitation-induced erosion. You can call it what you like. We know that the Sahara Desert, and the Sphinx sits on the edge of the Sahara Desert, is a relatively recent desert geologically.
There is some evidence that, for example, the Sahara Desert was more moist, had running streams and rivers, had lakes that were larger, had wildlife that was consistent with a more humid environment, and it's pretty reasonable to guess that that was also the case in Eastern Africa, where Egypt is. Northern Africa in general does seem to have been wetter and more humid, probably cooler than it is in the present day.
The Sahara has not always been a Sahara. The Sahara was once, in very recent times, geologically speaking, was non-desert. You had a much more lush savanna type region. You had lakes, ephemeral lakes, you had rivers. We know this from a variety of data now, including imaging from satellites, where you can pick up ancient riverbeds, etc. I believe that it makes sense that when you had less aridity, more water, more vegetation, well, helped promote ancient cultures.
The population of Egypt was in the hundreds of thousands, perhaps approaching 1 million, during the heyday of early Egypt, when the magnificent megalithic structures of the Giza Plateau were being built by those highly ingenious and industrious Egyptians of Ice Age times. And obviously, such could not have occurred in the present environment there, which is one of the driest places on Earth. This was a different place then, with a climate similar to that of southeastern US or the pampas of Argentina. This climate must have been attractive to those sophisticated surveyors and engineers who masterminded the gargantuan structures of the Giza Plateau, preeminent of which is the famous Great Pyramid.
In the Old Kingdom times, when you're building the pyramids, the superstructure of the Great Pyramid, for instance, best estimates are you need, incredible workforce. You have to house them, you have to feed them. And there have been found in recent years around the edge, the periphery of the Giza Plateau, evidence of bakeries, evidence of encampments, that type of thing, for a fairly large settlement, a fairly large number of workers in Old Kingdom times. back in pre-dynastic times, it was lusher and not as barren desert, so you could have more food and supplies maybe produced, I wouldn't say on site, but in more the local area.
The Great Pyramid is an amazing artifact of a higher culture. It's made of 2.5 to 3 million blocks of stone. The smaller ones are several tons, and the larger ones are dozens of tons. I think there's one that's about 70 tons in the King's Chamber. And supposedly it was built during Khufu's reign, a period of 20 to 30 years, something like that. And it just is inconceivable how you could put that many large stones into place in that period of time. Because if you think about it nowadays, you're trying to move a 50-ton stone, you know, that's you'll plan that for several weeks and then get your whole crew together to move one stone. That knowledge is lost.
That shows a level of sophistication and engineering that's just mind-boggling. But it's also aligned with incredible accuracy to the true North Pole of the Earth. Not just a magnetic pole, not just approximately the North Pole, but incredible accuracy to the true North Pole. In fact, it's the most accurately aligned building ever constructed before the 19th century. They were doing something that no one could replicate for thousands of years.
The Great Pyramid at Egypt is not on a very recognizable meridian because our modern meridian system is based upon Greenwich. The 0 point is placed at Greenwich for recent historical reasons. But if we assume that the prime meridian is at the longitude of the Giza Plateau, then all these other sacred sites around the world, like for example at Angkor and other places, fit nicely into this harmonic grid. These sites are separated by 72 degrees and so on, which are proportions of the precessional cycle.
This amazingly accurate ancient world grid of longitudes and latitudes was actually surveyed with a relatively simple mechanical device, which allowed the ancients to accurately measure Earth distances by measuring the movement of the constellations of the zodiac along the horizon due to precession.
Well, precession is the slow wobble of the Earth's axis, and it would like a gyroscope in space. It's a slow wobble like a gyroscope as it orbits around the sun. And the slow wobble like a gyroscope would cycle once in 25,920 years. The ancients with the Celtic cross or the archaeometer, a simple handheld mechanical device, measured the rate that the constellations of the zodiac appear to move along the horizon very slowly because of this wobble of the Earth's axis like a gyroscope. And it would wobble once in 25,920 years. They measured the rate that this wobble occurs. It's 72 years per 1 degree. The constellations appear to move along the horizon because of precession. So they knew this rate, they measured this rate, and they knowing the geometry of a hexagon and a circle, you take a hexagon, a 6-sided figure, all right? Put it within the circle of the Earth, so to say. So you have this hexagon in there. If you know the length of one side of that Earth hexagon, we'll call it, if you know the length of that, or the amount of time it will take for the constellations to move along that section of the Earth hexagon, you thereby know the radius of that circle. So if you know that length along one side of the Earth where you're measuring the precession to be occurring, if you can measure that, you have the length of the radius of the Earth. Thereby you have the circumference of the Earth. So they could measure and map the Earth with this simple mechanical device.
The length of the perimeter of the base of the Great Pyramid is half a nautical mile. And this is no coincidence, because the ancient Egyptians subdivided the length of one side of the Earth hexagon by 7,200 for the length of their Great Pyramid's base perimeter, and as 440 cubits compose of the length of each of the 4 base edges of the Great Pyramid. we see that the length of the cubit, which is 20.632 inches, is 4 times 440 divided into 1/7200th of the length of the radius of the Earth, which is the same length as the length of one side of the 6-sided Earth hexagon. The ancient Egyptian cubit used to survey the pyramid was astronomically derived by measuring the rate of precession and applying such to simple geometry, and not by a number of hand widths or finger lengths as had been generally proposed by archaeologists. In addition, the height of the Great Pyramid is 280 cubits, so the pi relationship is embodied in the dimensions of the Great Pyramid because the 880 cubit length of 2 base sides of the Great Pyramid, which represents the diameter of the Earth, is 3.14. The value of pi times the 280 cubit height of the Great Pyramid. So the dimensions of the Great Pyramid are self-evidently an embodiment of the dimensions of the Earth, which were accurately measured with the simple mechanical device, the archaeometer, also known as the Celtic cross, which allowed the ancients to measure and thereby subdivide the dimensions of the Earth to establish the length of the royal cubit, and therewith to survey and construct the Great Pyramid as a reduced embodiment of the dimensions of the Earth.
Pi is definitely encoded within the Great Pyramid, and what we see is that if you take the height of the Great Pyramid from the center of the base to the apex, consider that R, radius of a circle. Take the perimeter of the base of the Great Pyramid, consider that C. Everyone knows the formula from grade school, 2 pi R equals circumference. The base of the Great Pyramid is the circumference. The height of the Great Pyramid is R. 2 times the height times pi equals the perimeter of the base. Clearly, pi is included within the Great Pyramid.
Since the Great Pyramid constructors surveyed the dimensions of that magnificent edifice to precession by the measurement of the dimensions of the Earth through simple hexagon geometry and the application of the 72-year per 1 degree rate of the apparent movement of the constellations of the zodiac along the horizon, they could have planned the Great Pyramid to be 1/3600th of the radius of the Earth, which would have been 1 nautical mile. So the Great Pyramid would then be twice as big as it is. But since that would have been logistically very difficult to achieve, they went with half a nautical mile. And that the base perimeter length of the Great Pyramid is half a nautical mile is no coincidence, because that same Earth measuring and surveying technique was used to map the Earth, and that was the forerunner of our modern mapping and timekeeping system.
Yeah, the significance of ancients having this capability to measure and map the Earth, well, that flies in the face of what the conventionals has been teaching us, obviously. You know, they taught us that the development of mankind has been a kind of an evolutionary Darwinian type progression from cavemen through quasi-cavemen, Neolithic, up until modern men at around 3000 BC. But their own corollary theory to that is that this megalithic building, sophisticated megalithic building, started suddenly, abruptly, with no evolutionary precursors in building style leading up to it. The Great Pyramids appeared out of nowhere.
They were not only astute sky watchers, but they were what we might call surveyors of the Earth. They were mappers, and so they would map out the Earth. So what we have is many sacred sites around the world that are located on specific meridians, specific latitudes and longitudes, and they seem to be placed in harmonic relationship with each other.
The ancient navigators were able to determine their position anywhere on the earth to within 3 nautical miles by triangulating their position according to how long it would take for the constellations to move to the same position in the sky as at the base reference point, which in the ancient world was the Great Pyramid. Many of the ancient maps which were used as a source maps for the unusually accurate medieval maps showing Antarctica and other coastlines which supposedly weren't discovered until the 1800s. It was on the prime meridian of the ancient world, and the ancient mapping system related time to distance, just as does our modern system of arc seconds and arc minutes, also known as nautical miles, and thereby they did indeed map and navigate much of the world in ancient times.
So here we are trying to look back and interpret what the ancients knew, and we tend to filter that information, consciously or not, through our own biases, our own context. And the principal context we use is that evolution is fairly linear, that we went from caveman to modern man and a few bumps along the way, but we're progressing. However, if you use the ancient context, that life is cyclical, just as the day and the seasons are cyclical, then if you go back far enough, actually prior to about 1500 BC, you would expect to start to see things that reflect a higher consciousness. And so it presents a whole different way to look at the archaeological record.
In the archaeological record, there's been recent discoveries that indicate that there were connections between, for example, the Phoenicians and South America. For example, there were Roman trading vessels found in the mouth of the Amazon. There's actually a lot of evidence that there were contacts going on around the world.
But scientists have always said there's no way that navigators could have been navigating the oceans around 2000 BC. They were in skin-covered, rudimentary canoe-like vessels. And on top of that, navigating? Forget about it. But as we've shown through the astronomically derived dimensions of the Great Pyramid of Giza, the Great Pyramid dimensions are an embodiment of the dimensions of the Earth. So in fact, these guys around 2000 BC, as the diffusionist theorists thought, imagined that they could somehow navigate. They didn't know exactly how, but with this finding, this precession mapping finding, we have shown that they actually could measure the dimensions of the Earth and thereby chart and map it accordingly.
And I think the more we look at, we see remarkable similarities among cultures, even if they're separated by oceans. Furthermore, you start looking at ancient cultures, and they could navigate large water bodies. They could navigate the oceans.
We have a hunch that the Atlanteans were able to navigate the seas. We have great similarities between Mexico and Egypt. You turn an Egyptian sideways, he looks like a Mayan Indian. You have the same pyramids. You have commonalities in the languages. There are Mayan characters in the Egyptian language. So how did that happen? Well, they had to have a way to get across.
The Orontius Phineas map shows Antarctica when the Ice Age had just begun, because a small polar ice pack is shown on the Orontius Phineas map. And the mountains and river valleys of the continent of Antarctica, the land mass below all the current snow and ice, he showed those mountains and river valleys accurately, very accurately, longitude and latitude, incredibly. And this is borne out with our remote sensing in modern times. We can sense down through that 2 miles of snow and ice and see what the underlying terrain is like, and it jibes perfectly with that Orontius Phineas map, or virtually, beyond coincidence, beyond our wildest hopes that it could be a coincidence. Just right there it is. Greenland, same thing. The Ibn Zara map shows details of Greenland, the details of the mountain ranges and the river valleys incredibly precisely. But it's now under a mile of snow and ice. They couldn't have known that. They were mapping that thing. They were mapping those continents early in the Ice Age, before the Ice Age had totally built up upon them. Now going back to Antarctica, Orontius Phineas map early in the Ice Age, a little bit of snowpack on Antarctica. And the Piri Reis map apparently shows a couple hundred years later, the ice pack had grown. A few of the mountain ranges near the shoreline were still showing, but the ice pack had grown. Again, with the exact precision of where the mountain ranges and river valleys are, that are now 2 miles under snow and ice.
So the ancients were measuring and mapping the globe during the Ice Age, and even in the early stages of the Ice Age. So what caused the Ice Age, which the evidence indicates ended at around 1500 BC?
The fact is, we don't know what the beginning of an ice age is. We really don't know how the ice caps, say, over North America begin to grow. And maybe an ice age begins with heavier snowfalls associated with open water. We absolutely have no idea what really happens at the beginning of a glacial expansion.
When you have a cold area, even if it's relatively dry, just a little bit amount of snow accumulating over years and years and years still amounts to a lot of snow, just like we have in Antarctica. So it never really melts. So that's the main thing, is it can be cold, relatively dry, but just a little amount of snow accumulated over a long period of time still represents a lot of snow. We clearly have evidence that the planet was not a snowball Earth, was not covered in snow, that the tropics still existed.
Warmer oceans must have caused the Ice Age, because with colder ocean waters, from a colder environment, you get colder oceans, so you'd have less evaporation off the oceans, so you'd have less cloud cover than today if the Ice Age atmosphere was colder than today, and or the Ice Age oceans were colder than today. Therefore, the Ice Age oceans must have been warmer than today, paradoxically, because only with warmer ocean water do you get the higher evaporation rate to create the dense cloud cover for the Ice Age.
However, conventional scientists insist that all the seasons of the year were colder during the Ice Age. But with the dense global encompassing cloud cover of the Ice Age, cooler summers and warmer winters ensued, resulting in little snow melt in the summer and greater snowfall in the winter. As snowfall amounts are maximized near 32 degrees Fahrenheit, and super cold environments are technically deserts.
I would expect that the ice caps during the Ice Age came about not because there was a lot more snow, at least not over a very long period, but because it was enough colder in the summer that the snow that did fall didn't melt. Generally speaking, very cold areas of the world tend to be very dry. This is true nowadays. Antarctica is a very, very dry continent. But because it never gets warm enough for the ice and snow to melt, it's covered with snow, or covered with glaciers. Siberia in the wintertime is very, very dry. But because it's extremely cold, what snow does fall stays, and so you get a good snow cover.
The conventionals once again say that the Ice Age was caused by cooler temperatures because during the Milankovitch cycle, which is where the ellipse of the orbit of the Earth changes over time every 100,000 years. Once in 100, or through a period during 100,000 years, the Earth is farther away from the sun, therefore the atmosphere is a bit cooler, therefore you have the Ice Age. That's the big explanation in conventional circles for the cause of the Ice Age. But we've shown it could not be colder temperatures. What mainstream scientists say is the cause is hydrologically impossible. Therefore, we have to look at another mechanism for warmer ocean waters. And conventional scientists don't say it was warmer ocean waters, but we've shown, according to Hydrology 101, it had to have been warmer ocean waters.
It is now clear that the ancients measured and mapped the globe during the Ice Age, when there was intense snowfall in the extreme latitudes and much more rainfall in the middle latitudes, where the great ancient civilizations began. So what caused this heating of the oceans for the high evaporation rates to form the dense cloud cover of the Ice Age? It could not have been global warming, because if such warming had increased the surface temperature of the oceans for higher evaporation rates, causing the cloud cover, it would have shielded the Earth from the sun and cooled the atmosphere back down, a buffer system. So the heating of the oceans must have been geothermally induced, from heat sourced from within the Earth, not from the atmosphere. It has been established that the oceans during the Ice Age were paradoxically warmer, but how much warmer and what geothermal event or events caused that warmer ocean water for the dense cloud cover for the Ice Age, this will now be a subject of great debate.